Before dawn on 18th August 1940, while most of Britain's civilian population huddled under blackout curtains awaiting the next Luftwaffe raid, a strange quiet hum vibrated across the lawns of a Victorian estate in Buckinghamshire. The stately main house, Bletchley Park, was becoming something the public would not understand for half a century: an intelligence factory. Hut 6, a wooden structure that smelled of wet timber, carbon paper and hot tea, was, by late summer, already burning through German red Luftwaffe keys and green Heer keys. The RAF's fighter command, the men flying Hurricanes of No. 11 Group out of Biggin Hill and Tangmere, would never see the faces behind the reports they called simply, "Why service take?" They didn't have to. Code breaking in 1940 had become a weapon, as real as an autocannon or a Merlin engine bolted to a Spitfire's firewall. The struggle was speed and scale and human exhaustion. There were no supercomputers, just bomb racks in the converted stable block, running night shifts under the care of Wrens, who could set rotor orders faster than most men typed. Each day, each hour, mattered. The Luftwaffe was now targeting sector stations and radar chain masts along the south coast. Bletchley Park's decrypts told Air Marshal Keith Park where the next massed Gruppe might form. Yet the chain of production was fragile. One missed indicator group, one misaligned crib, could leave 1,000 pilots without the picture. A now declassified GC&CS minute dated 24th August 1940, initialed DAL, likely Dilwyn Knox, reads in dry pencil, "This is not chess, it is artillery." That line has become iconic in cryptologic circles because it captured the shift in worldview inside the huts. Solving an Enigma key was no longer an intellectual flex. It was a live-fire contribution to war, but the diary entries from ordinary staffers capture the emotional weight better. One Wren in Hut 6 wrote in her notebook, "We know before Fighter Command knows, sometimes hours before, and then we sit very quietly at our desks." The quiet, the restraint, the inability to tell even other staff what you had seen in the decrypts. That was the culture. The dead pilots would be carried home in the morning, and the women who had read the German operational orders that launched the raid in the first place could say nothing. There was also, even in the early months, a psychological rift forming inside the huts. The people in Hut 6 were closest to the apparent front line. They handled the tactical Luftwaffe and Heer keys, the keys that drove daily bloodshed. Hut 8, Turing's shop, was working Kriegsmarine material, and while the naval war was existential, it moved slower, more abstractly. Hut 6 felt the pressure of immediacy. A decrypted Luftflotte 2 message could turn into a scramble order within 20 minutes. That urgency created friction, heroism, and occasional serious mistakes. Yet something else was forming below the surface. Because Bletchley Park's workflow had an unintentional vulnerability. Every decrypted message, every strip of additive, every rotor setting, every crib generated paper, carbon copies, interim worksheets, hand-marked indicator groups, and those paper traces had to be burned, but sometimes they weren't burned immediately. Sometimes they sat, in trays, in Hut 6, until a night shift runner took them to the incinerator behind the mansion. And the carbon paper, the blue-grey, film that carried ghost impressions of every character, typed through it, was logged, counted, and supposed to be consumed at a strict rate. This is the needle's eye through which the entire betrayal would later thread. But no one in mid-late 1940 could imagine that possibility. They barely had time to sleep. US Army liaison had not yet arrived. Churchill hadn't yet visited and uttered his famous line about the goose that laid the golden eggs. For the small, overstretched handful in Hut 6, the war was simple. Keep the Luftwaffe order traffic flowing into readable English before the next raid timed out the value. Radar, guns, and code breaking had merged. This was the moment Ultra stopped being a theory and became a weapon system. And in that moment of furious output, of caffeinated blindness to anything except rotor orders and crib tables, vulnerabilities were born. No one suspected an insider. No one suspected that carbon copy shortages could signal something darker. But the paper trail would soon begin to speak in whispers. And those whispers would point not to the Luftwaffe, but to someone inside the fence. Next, in Part 2, the first anomalies. By the winter of 1942, the geography of Allied code-breaking changed. The Americans were now no longer polite visitors. They were partners with teeth. The Brucer Agreement, signed 17th May 1943, but functionally active in pipeline form months earlier, had begun shaping the tempo of SIGINT exchange between the GC&CS and the US Army's Signal Intelligence Service. American cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall and the US Navy's OP-20G at Nebraska Avenue were receiving selective slices of ultra, redacted, trimmed, curated, but undeniably powerful. Bletchley Park had become the headwaters. Washington, D.C., still thick with ration-era cheap coffee and wartime blackout rules, had become downstream consumers. This meant a new class of forms: courier packets, pouch logs, CI sheets, tally sheets, paperwork that could be traced and counted. Paper numbers, code word counts, copy control. The bureaucracy of trust and bureaucracy, ironically, is where the first fracture line appeared. Hut 6 was running 3 shifts by mid-autumn. 1942, the Luftwaffe keys, the traffic, labelled Flug, Jäger, Nacht, shortwave point-to-point beams used by Gruppencommandos in France, the Low Countries and Western Germany, were generating a mountain of intermediate material. Every intercept that went through a Type X machine with a British plug board adapter produced carbon prints. Every one of those prints had to be paired with a carbon paper log entry, which meant a missing sheet wasn't just clerical, it was statistically anomalous, MI5. Section B1B, noticed first B1B, had the unglamorous job no one in the glamorous parts of code breaking wanted: internal sabotage detection. They weren't the double-cross dazzlers, not the men behind the XX Committee's battle-space chess. They were the quiet internal housekeeping branch, who checked burn logs, requisition forms, paper tallies. And in late 1942, they noticed something that wasn't loud enough to trigger an alarm, but was mathematically impossible to ignore: carbon. Roll consumption in Hut 6 didn't match the message decryption counts. The first red flag was logged. 7th of December 1942, a night shift entry done by a junior civilian staffer who wrote, with almost comic understatement, "Roll count irregular, possibly misreported by day shift." That was all. A harmless line. No arrows, no panic, no memo to higher command. But here is the larger context. The Americans, the SIS, were now receiving raw ultra-frame material that had to be matched one for one with green copy logs. Those logs did not match the tally of expended carbon rolls, meaning someone had access to the stream before distribution, but after raw decrypt. That is precisely the choke point where sabotage matters most. We now know from later declassifications of KV series MI5 files that this gap wasn't trivial. The discrepancy at first was fractions of a percent, maybe 4 decrypts out of 1,000 per 24-hour period. But the pattern did not scatter randomly. The missing material only clustered around 2 categories: Luftwaffe, regional logistics traffic, fuel and dispersal; Abwehr, regional directives, especially from Münster and Kassel. Both of those categories had immediate tactical value for Berlin, but were too low profile to appear suspicious if leaked. That choice alone reveals sophistication, which means our unknown insider wasn't stealing glory decrypts like U-boat keys or top-line Luftflotte planning. They were lifting the quiet, mundane signals that made the war machine breathe. The thefts showed intelligence, discipline, and the timing was worse. The missing carbon slips occurred almost exclusively on the night shift, the shift that was least supervised and which had the loosest pouch-seal discipline, because night bundles were often dispatched before the courier clerks had full staff. We also know, retrospectively, that around this period, Hut 6 began quietly shuffling internal seating, a method of variance testing not publicly documented. People were moved without explanation. Night shift supervisors rotated at irregular intervals. Yet none of these maneuvers were accompanied by formal MI5 investigation language, because at this stage, there still wasn't enough to accuse anyone. All they had were numbers. All they had were statistical ghosts. So the Americans, without knowing it, had become part of the detection grid, because raw ultraflow had to be mirrored to Arlington Hall, and when the inbound American count didn't match the outbound British log, the inconsistency couldn't hide inside domestic British channels. This is the part of the story most documentaries never show. The betrayal's smoke trail was first discovered because of a transatlantic reconciliation of paper usage. Paper, not cryptanalysis, betrayed the betrayer But at this point in the timeline, no one knew who. No one knew if it was malice or just administrative entropy. The whispers were still whispers. Next, in part 3, the irregularities multiply and the anomaly begins to look intentional. Inside Bletchley Park, small things were often louder than gunfire. On paper, a vanished carbon slip, a page count that didn't land exactly at the expected modulus of 5, a night shift Type X platen that had been wiped too clean. By early March 1943, B1B's anomaly board, a simple oilcloth grid nailed beside a filing cupboard in the mansion, showed enough dots that even the most cautious investigators stopped calling it clerical drift. The irregularities were not trending with mailroom volume. They were trending with topic, Abwehr regional directives and Luftwaffe rear area transport, the quiet arteries. Never the glamorous arteries. A real insider would avoid glamour. Glamour gets audited. The struggle now became epistemic. How do you investigate a leak inside a machine whose prime directive is silence? You could not storm into Hut 6 and announce a mole hunt. You could not even ask many of the questions needed to build a baseline, because simply asking them risked revealing where the vulnerabilities lay. Internal counterintelligence in wartime codebreaking is like a surgeon operating on his own tongue. Every incision is a risk to the instrument. Itself.mi5 began what they later described, in a 1949, oral recollection to the Home Office, as damped investigation. It meant do not disturb the signal. Instead, pull weak threads in the background. Retrieve burn bag ash from the furnaces behind the main house and sieve it for undeclared carbon flecks. Reconcile requisition stubs with invoices, but do so by querying 2 different clerks separately, so neither realizes the reconciliation is happening. And most critically, quietly, reorder the seating plan. Seat movement within Bletchley Park was common enough that no one asked questions. But to B1B, seat moves were like turning dials in a lab experiment. Who sits near which racks? Whose count divergence persists even when their neighbors change? A small number of watchers, not cryptanalysts, now walk the park's gravel paths with unremarkable faces. They were not there to break enigma. They were there to count which people entered, which huts at which hours, and how long they lingered at the trays. A diary fragment from a Y service signals clerk dated 19th of March 1943 records a chillingly ordinary note. Saw a strange man outside Hut 6. Not sure he belongs to us. The clerk never knew that man was MI5. His presence, his notebook, his silence were part of an invisible counter-campaign. Meanwhile, the cryptanalytic routine continued unabated because it had to. RAF bomber raids into Western Germany now depended on ultra-driven avoidance of the heaviest flak belt relocations. The 19 March 1943 raid on Kiel involved 208 aircraft from Bomber Command. Bletchley intercepts of Luftwaffe night fighter dispositions were used, same day, to shift Mosquito Pathfinder timing by 8 minutes. That shift probably saved lives, but it was based on traffic that might also be bleeding out to Berlin through an insider only a corridor away. The reveal, the moment everything tilted, was not dramatic. It was a table, a single 2-column distribution sheet, a Luftflotte 3 logistics take dated 22nd of March 1943. The official carbon count said 8 copies. The American routing log, in Arlington Hall, had recorded receipt of only 7. That alone could be a clerical slip, but the Hut 6 internal pouch list, checked against cryptanalytic page count, tallied 9. That cannot happen accidentally. Paper doesn't self-replicate. Someone had manually created a duplicate interim copy in the hut before pouch sealing. MI5 now knew intent. This was no random waste, no operator fatigue. Someone had taken 1 and left no trace except math. But the application of that insight, in real time, was suffocatingly limited. Britain's 1943 internal secrecy laws and the risk calculus of Ultra meant the hut could not be shut, not even temporarily. You could not contaminate output at scale to lay a trap, because Bomber Command and the Atlantic convoy timetable depended on the decrypt stream. The machine had to run while the infection was diagnosed, and so the watchers, the grey men, changed their gait. They began to hover a fraction longer in side halls. They began to inspect cuff seams. They began to check pocket bulges that looked like folded envelopes. They began quietly to map which staffers exhibited tray, curiosity. the subtle desire to linger a second longer over a crib, sheet that wasn't assigned to them. The close of this phase is defined by an ambiguity that historians still argue about. At some point between the last week of March and the first week of April 1943, MI5 internal memos shift from subjunctive, maybe leakage, to declarative, leak present. But the identity column of the suspect grid is still blank. The paper says only, within Hut 6, no name, no rank, no motive. The mole has shape, but not face. Next, in Part 4, external wartime effects begin to surface. In German behavior, the most unnerving clue did not come from inside the mansion. It arrived indirectly from the Bay of Biscay. In May 1943, a U-boat retrieval group, the Kriegsmarines II, Sicherungsdivision, altered convoy routing in a way that could not be explained by radar sightings, DF triangulation, or Luftwaffe coastal reconnaissance. At Bletchley, this became known informally as a bounce back, an enemy operational correction that mapped almost one-to-one against Ultra Take. It meant, in brutally plain language, that the Reich was learning something from British decrypts before British aircrews had even finished using them. The struggle in this month was twofold. First, tactically, the Allies had a sense that something was changing in the German low-level command reflex chain, especially in rear-area fuel logistics around Nantes and Lorient. These were the naval pens where the Germans hardened their U-boat pens in ferroconcrete, so thick that even Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs later in the war struggled to crack them. A pattern emerged. Convoys that looked vulnerable on Tuesday would suddenly reroute by Wednesday, but only those convoys that were the subject of Hut 6 decrypt work product. Other convoys, ones the British had not broken that week, continued unchanged. Second, psychologically, the staff at GC&CS had to face a new, chilling possibility. The insider, whoever they were, wasn't simply leaking for vanity or money. The pattern implied professional discipline. The leaks were curated. Not all decrypt categories bled. Only ones where the changes would produce low explosive signature to Allied hearts, far from the RAF's emotive air battles, and unlikely to draw suspicion. A small May 1943 letter from Lieutenant Ajigi, George C. Duncan, temporarily attached to OP-20G, described the effect from the American side. There are too many cases where the Germans react to us before we react to them. Washington wasn't accusing the British of mishandling. They didn't yet fathom that an insider inside the inner sanctum could be the source to understand how close the signals community was to the truth, and yet still stranded from the face of the betrayer. We have to understand the internal architecture of Hut 6. In early 1943, Hut 6's workflow was divided broadly into registration, indexing, cribs, machine room, bomb liaison. The mole could only operate efficiently on a seam where raw decrypt had been translated, but before the output had been batched into ultra-grade digests. That seam was the trays. The trays, specifically the slip trays, were where the ghosts lived. MI5's B1B had by June built what is now, in retrospect, a crude but ingenious signature map. The carbon paper discrepancy correlated almost perfectly with decrypts that were processed in the slot roughly between 01:15 and 03:10 hours local time. That late night zone was the dead zone of supervision, when one Hut 6 supervisor might be soaking his tea in the break room and the others were too far in the zone to notice a sheet lifted from the stack. In a moment captured in a June 1943 counterintelligence note, leakage is presently live, not theoretical. It was the closest internal Bletchley language ever came to panic. The reveal, that summer, came not from the British side. It came from the Germans, or at least from their pattern. On 23 June 1943, Luftwaffe traffic concerning maritime fuel depot transfers near Quimper matched precisely, within 2 hours, a decrypted key in Hut 6 that had not yet been framed for wider distribution. No one outside the hut had seen the sheet, but Berlin behaved as if they had. This gave B1B a proof-of-life moment for the betrayal, proof that they were not chasing random noise. And here's the cruel science of counterintelligence. Once you know the leak is real, you still can't stop the workflow. The Allies could not pause ultraflow, not for a day, not for an hour, because Halifax convoys, returning from New York via Argentia, needed routing protection in real time, because Bomber Command needed night fighter windowing, because U-boat sink rates were still lethal. The application for the modern listener is stark. The most secret, Allied capability could not defend itself, because its usefulness was too essential to interrupt. By July 1943, the covert watchers in Bletchley, the MI5 staff, had shifted posture from "is someone leaking?" to "which one?" Seating changes became more volatile. Night shift assignments were deliberately scrambled. Temporary transfers were induced simply to watch what happened to the carbon paper numbers. The leak did not stop. The mole adjusted with the seating. What the watchers now knew, painfully, was this: the mole was not passively benefiting from access. They understood the control measures and were working around them like a counter-cryptanalyst. And in the next phase, B1B would decide they needed a trigger, a seeded lie, to flush him out. Next, in Part 5, the false train cipher is born. The trap was born not in the mansion, but 2 miles away, in a Spartan side office of MI5's B1B temporary detachment in Buckinghamshire. The idea, simple in phrasing, lethal in application, was to insert a single fabricated tactical snippet into a real Luftwaffe logistics cipher stream, with just enough pulse strength that if Berlin reacted within a narrow window, then the insider had passed it on. The false target, a phantom Luftflotte 6 fuel and rolling stock transfer to Kassel, nominally scheduled 12 August 1943. The planted detail was technically minor, a convoy of tanker rail wagons supposed to roll north of Frankfurt toward the Reich's central maintenance spine. But in war, logistics is force projection, and a phantom fuel convoy is not a harmless fable. Any German reaction would tell the entire truth in one stroke. This is what the war had come to. Bletchley Park had to deceive not the Germans, but itself, to find the bleed. The struggle, beginning first week of August 1943, was the moral one. To set a trap of this nature meant B1B had to selectively seed the false crib into a Hut 6 decrypt, which meant at least 2 GC&CS workers had to be lied to. It is an extraordinary moment if you think about it in human terms. Bletchley Park, the most disciplined analytic institution of the war, had to contaminate its own stream of truth in order to rescue truth. A Hut 6 internal clerk, who never knew the trap existed, typed the phantom reference into a slip tray under the assumption it was legitimate Luftflotte traffic. Only 3 MI5 watchers even knew the line of code that marked the bait. The false cipher was injected at 22:10 hours on 12th of August under routine green here Luft tag. It flowed, as if ordinary, into the tray. 48 hours later, the reveal. On 14th August 1943, Bletchley's Y-Service intercept chain snagged a Luftwaffe ops update from a Münster relay station acknowledging a traffic reshuffle in the fuel vectoring group, referencing exactly the phantom, Kassel transfer window. The Germans reacted to a train that did not exist, and crucially, this acknowledgement was encrypted in a fresh daily key that no one outside Hut 6 had yet seen. That is the choke point. MI5 now possessed what cryptanalysis alone could not produce: proof of life of the betrayer, mathematically hardened by operational effect. The insider had taken the bait and activated Berlin's reflex. The modern application for SIGINT analysts is profound. The most powerful counterintelligence weapon is not surveillance. It is controlled misinformation, selectively poisoning the waterline of the data stream to see who drinks. Now MI5, for the first time, could tighten the net. There was no longer philosophical doubt. There was no longer statistical hesitation. This was not entropy. This was not sloppy burn discipline. Someone, inside the fence, was passing ultra-grade readouts to the enemy within hours of the decrypt step. And now, for the first time, MI5 had a time-stamped window. The fabrications had only been visible in Hut 6 for roughly 90 minutes before the suspected lift. That narrowed access to fewer than 30 individuals, and shift logs, which had been quietly improved in June, narrowed further to fewer than 12, a night shift supervisor, unnamed in surviving KV index fragments, later recalled the atmosphere of those next nights as a kind of cold. Electricity. He would later tell a memoir interviewer in 1968, "We all felt the presence of someone with 2 faces." Counterintelligence. Teams began marking personal envelopes held at hut exits. A handful of Type-X carriage return clicks, which normally would be meaningless, were listened to like a Geiger counter for treachery. MI5 watchers didn't question suspects. They timed them. Who leaves the rack 3 minutes slower tonight? Who lingers one heartbeat too long over a non-assigned crib? This was not a manhunt. It was surgical, and yet, even now, no name. Only access windows, only pattern response, only the shadow of a shadow. But by the end of August 1943, MI5 had an internal memo, 6 lines, marked Most Secret, Ultra, that included 2 devastating words that changed posture forever. Suspect isolated. We do not know which of the handful was the focus of that line. The Official Secrets Act has sealed the identity beyond the span of most human lives. But we know the meaning of those 2 words. The insider, the spy, had been zeroed to one individual, which leads to the final movement of this invisible war, where Bletchley does the unthinkable. It removes a man from the story. Next, in Part 6, the extraction, the sealed file, and the unanswered modern question, how much blood did this betrayal cost? What happened next, in September 1943, is almost absent from official war histories. It exists instead in edges, ellipses, and negative space. We know that on a grey morning in the first half of the month, a single Hut 6 staffer was quietly reassigned to London, War Office Special Tasking. Their pass was pulled, their desk cleared by someone else, their bicycle removed from the shed behind the mansion. No announcement, no farewell tea. In an environment where the greatest secret in the world, Ultra, remained buried even from most of the RAF and Army General Staff, this disappearance was not impossible to hide. It was merely not spoken of again. One Bletchley veteran, in a 1975 BBC oral history, spoke of it indirectly. One day we saw him, the next we didn't. That was all. This is the real shape of counterintelligence success in wartime. Not a courtroom, not a mugshot. Absence. We know the struggle of that final phase because of the context around it. London, by late 1943, was a universe of compartmented shadows. MI5 was juggling the double-cross system, managing German agents who had been flipped and were feeding London blackened information. There were internal rows inside the XX committee about the order of deception priorities leading into overlord planning, and arrayed inside that same capital, invisibly overlapping, was a single-sealed human problem, an insider at the heart of Ultra who had just been surgically excised. The evidence pattern is brutally clean. The carbon paper. Anomalies vanish from MI5's logs the week after the removal. Logistics bounce back stop showing. Correlation, the small unexpected. Reflex signature in rear area Luftwaffe organs evaporates from intercept maps. The leak, whatever form it took, ends. But the identity is still, to this hour, not public. GCNCS did not prosecute. They did not reveal. They did not risk open scandal with Washington, or risk the very existence of the Ultra secret by prosecuting in peacetime. Ultra remained so protected that even Winston Churchill ordered, in 1945, that nearly every trace of bomber and Type-X machinery be destroyed or buried rather than risk post-war. Exposure, that is the reveal of this entire story. Not the leak, but the silence about the leak. If one stands on the lawn of present-day Bletchley Park today, among the tourist signage, the restored huts, the bomb reconstructions, one would never see the grave of the betrayal. It is buried not in the grounds, but in a small handful of KV series files, so redacted that even their page counts are partially withheld in the National Archives Catalogue Index. And that is where the modern reflection arrives. How do you measure the human cost of a leak whose data burned men in metal at 15,000 feet? What if a Wellington bomber of number 1, Squadron RAF, lost on a night raid over the Baltic in spring 1943, had been routed by a Luftwaffe sector officer tipped off by a sliver of Ultra taken from a single ghosted carbon copy? What if a few merchant mariners in convoy on 178, butchered by a wolf pack they never saw coming, were collateral damage of a mole reading crib slips 2 hours before they reached Arlington Hall? We will likely never assign casualty numbers to this betrayal. Bletchley Park's institutional decision, a decision backed by Churchill, was to protect Ultra ahead of all narrative clarity, which meant the mole's file did not become a courtroom. It became a sealed vault. Under the Official Secrets Act and under the deeper cultural vow inside GCNCS alumni, it became a dead star, visible only by the gravity of the distortions it left behind. The modern SIGINT professional can take only one lesson from this. The greatest secrets in the world do not die in noise. They die in the quiet. The betrayal at Bletchley Park was not caught by polygraphs, interrogators, or dramatic sting operations. It was caught by carbon paper mathematics and a single phantom fuel train in a cipher stream. It was resolved not by public justice, but by removal. A human being was subtracted from the ecosystem, and the war machine rolled on without a ripple. There is one surviving margin note. In a War Office liaison routing card dated autumn 1943, that taken in isolation is devastating. In pencil, in a small clerk's hand, in a column where one normally saw administrative shorthand like AH or H6NSUP, there are simply two letters, NR, no return, and the ultra-miracle continued. For D-Day, for the Atlantic, for the death of the U-boats, for the burning of the Reich. But someone, one person, never returned to the story to see it. They exited the war through a door with no handle.